Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone is secured in their space, in their comfort zone. We welcome you all from the Office of Multicultural Affairs for our next installment for Digital Diversity Days. And for those of you who are folks who are members of our beautiful community here at Johns Hopkins University, you know what we're about. And this particular presentation is going to be another addition to the great work that our colleagues are doing across the nation, and particularly around race and ethnicity. So from our office and the university, we'd like to extend a thank you to the faculty and staff who are present, but most importantly, the most important treasure of our institution is our students. And so we hope that you get some great grounding and information for today. D3, Digital Diversity Days, was something that we as an office concocted and developed about a year ago, pre-COVID. And then COVID allowed us to kind of move forward with our plan. And we really wanted to focus on critical race theory, because we think that's a very core element. And so some of the objectives that you already seen really look at educating students and higher education practitioners on the framework of CRT, critical race theory, and its implications within higher education and the student experience. Another facet, another objective is to engage students and higher ed practitioners in intergroup dialogue on race, racism, and intersectionality. No matter how difficult it is, we believe that intergroup dialogue allows all folks to come into this conversation in such a way that's authentic and also informative and educational. And then we also want to provide students and higher ed practitioners with a race-conscious approach to understanding racial inequity and its intersectional relationship to other oppressive, marginalized identities, and how they may use their spheres of influence to dismantle all forms of oppression and inequitable systems. Now, that may seem like a daunting task, but I think we keep chipping it away session by session with the Digital Diversity Days. And so we're just thankful that we have our esteemed guest today. I also want to give props to the OMA team, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, and the DNI team. They do such great work, and I'm just so proud to be the director for the office. Now, you're probably wondering, who is this man speaking to me? I did not introduce myself. So appropriately enough, my name is Joseph Colon. I'm the proud director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs. My pronouns are he, him, his, and we are ready to get this party started. So I'm gonna flip it over to Kwame Phillips, our Assistant Director for Programming, and he's going to get us into the framework and kind of provide us some more information around our presenter. Kwame.
Thank you so much, Mr. Colon, for providing us the framework and the context of the D3 series and the amazing work that the Office of Multicultural Affairs and its team does every day to provide an experience that our students can call a community and home. D3 seeks to continue to provide a place for information sharing, but also a place where we can learn, grow, and really challenge ourselves to think about principles along the lines of critical race theory and anti-racist policies and action. And so and the team, we have extended invitation to Miss Nasha Wittenberg. Her resume is long and she's done some tremendous work as she is in the DEI field, the diversity, equity, and inclusion field. And so we're delighted to have her a part of the D3 series. I'm going to introduce her. She will be speaking about anti-racism within the higher ed system. I want to thank everyone who is attending and joining us this afternoon. If you can share in the chat where you're joining in from, let us know who's in the room and who's in the space so that Miss Nasha Wittenberg feels welcome here. So let us know. So Ms. Nasha Wittenberg has been a part of the North Carolina State University community for the past 3 years as the Director of Multicultural Affairs, Multicultural Student Affairs. Additionally, she is a professor in the College of Social Work with the emphasis on social justice, administration, supervision, and policy. Prior to joining WPAC, Nasha served as the director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs at Armstrong State University in Savannah, Georgia. With over 15 years of higher education experience and student engagement, she has established a sterling reputation as a dedicated and experienced higher ed professional, and has specialized in the area of providing a transformational service and leadership in the field of intercultural affairs. Wittenberg graduated from the University of South Carolina at Columbia, majoring in sociology. She then continued her education by pursuing her graduate studies at Stony Brook University in New York. Throughout her tenure, she has established university safe space LGBTQ orientation and awareness programs at their respective campuses, penned a grant that awarded the Armstrong African American Male Initiative Program, established the state of Georgia's first and only national recognized student African American Sisterhood chapter, and established the first nationally recognized chapter for MANA, a Latina Empowerment Network organization. In addition to MANA, she has established retention programs for Latino students, orchestrated outreach organization targeting Latinx students, Hola Hispanic Outreach and Leadership at Armstrong, and Camino College Access, Mentoring, Information, and Outreach. Wittenberg has received countless awards and accolades and presented on a number of panels, was a presenter during the 2017 NASPA Closing the Achievement Gap Student Success in Higher Education Conference in Washington, D.C. Nasha Wittenberg continues to redefine multiculturalism with her dynamic approach to create an environment that reflects diversity with dialogue, expression, and exposure. Again, we're excited to have Ms. Nasha Wittenberg. So we now present Ms. Nasha Wittenberg.
Thank you, Kwame. I'm smiling so hard. I'm like looking at the chat. And when you start seeing familiar faces, that's when the nerves kick in. And then when you start seeing relatives and cousins, and link sisters and sorority sisters and your former students from St. John's University and from Armstrong State University, it's like, okay. So it's like a big expectation to kind of feel. I did not know that this was a huge platform celebrating critical race theory, and I actually have included that in part of my discussion today. And so I'm really and truly just happy to be here and to have kind of like this big virtual reunion with all of my people and my folks. So I have my sage burning, the candles burning, and we are ready to go. I'm going to do this from a platform of storytelling. So I don't have like this PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to celebrate our ancestors and the Black art form of passing down our history and sharing our history through the art of storytelling. And what I mean by that is that, yes, we'll be discussing critical race theory, intersectional identities, and I have to do everything I do from a personal perspective. So what that means is I'll be touching on issues that had a direct impact on who I am, what makes me me, as well as discussing theory and how we can use theory to kind of move through. I did have a challenge with this word anti in front of racism. I am of the thought, because I'm also a historian, that are we at a place still where we can say anti-racism, right? And so I'll take you through the journey of my thought process behind that, and I look forward to a healthy discussion. What I will ask is that everyone remain respectful to each other in the chat. The point and purpose of these types of conversations is to allow space for a difference in ideas, ideologies, and perspectives, with an opportunity to learn more from those that are different from our own, as well as to listen, learn, and hear one another. So with that being said, I always like to start off any speaking engagement with a quote from an author who shapes my framework as an administrator in higher education. And in particular, this one is very personal because I will be touching on very personal challenges that shaped who I am. So if you see me looking down, I'm not texting, but I'm actually reading my notes. Okay. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Audre Lorde. And I think that's very fitting for anyone that discusses critical race theory, higher education, and just in general of knowing who you are and understanding your why. I don't introduce myself by saying my name is, rather I am. And I am Nasha Carmen Wittenberg, she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to be here with you today, this afternoon. Thank you to OMA, Office of Multicultural Affairs, and the staff at Johns Hopkins, faculty, as well as, most importantly, as Mr. Colon said, the students that are joining. So thank you so much, and let's get started. So on the lineup, again, we're gonna discuss critical race theory. And we're gonna, I like to go into history, I'm a historian, and talk a little bit about the desegregation of schools and that spark that makes me who I am. And we're going to address higher education and this alleged anti-racism concept from a historic perspective that is also personal. And I will go into my experience as a student at the University of South Carolina. So with that being said, let's start off with some family storytelling and a little bit of who I am. And I know I look great, but no, I was not born in 1960. But however, in 1960, a man by the name of A.J. Wittenberg was arrested. He was arrested for attending an anti-segregation rally and protest. In 1963, that man, A.J. Wittenberg, would file a lawsuit that would pave the way for his daughter, my cousin, Elaine Wittenberg Boyce, to be among the first desegregated schools for the state of South Carolina in 1964. That is my why. And that is part of the spark that makes me who I am as it relates to access and education. Then we get to what I like to discuss as my why and my who from the historic context and add in a little bit of current theory. I cannot discuss who I am without discussing my intersectionalities and my identity. And in order for me to do that, I have studied intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, and these are names you can jot down, and I'm sure I'll be able to shoot an email that can get it to you all if you all want to learn a little bit more, but I know that most of you on this call are very familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw discusses intersectionality and gender aspects regarding race. And when she was doing her research in the 1980s, it was critically underdeveloped. And to this day, it still is. And a quote from her, intersectionality allows us to see how not only multiple identities complicate our lives, but also how the very aspects of our identity that are sources of oppression in one environment serve as sources of privilege in another. And I mention this because not only am I Nasha Wittenberg, but I celebrate Nasha Wittenberg from a Black woman's perspective. And this is the lens that I'll be using as we continue our talk and our discussion today. And it's important for me to celebrate these as I introduce myself. I'm very particular about my pronouns, she, her. And that is part of that feminism and that feminist ideology and that fighter mentality really and truly hones in on making Nasha Carmen Wittenberg exactly who I am. And so from there, it's kind of challenging, and we'll touch back and forth with critical race theory, but there were a couple of points that I did want to make as we continue to the discussion. And so I definitely wanted to quote a little bit of what critical race theory is as we mention it, and for those of you who don't know. But it's a collection of activists and scholars who are basically interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. So let's talk again. The relationship, because there's a relationship there among race and racism and power. And critical race theorists, they consider the conventional civil rights and ethnic studies and discourses, that all that the civil rights and ethnic studies take up, right? But it places them in a much broader perspective, and a broader perspective that can be contextualized as the need fits. And this broader perspective includes economics, history. I told you I'm a historian, group and self-interest. It also includes feelings, for my Aries who might be on the Aquarius who don't like to say that they have feelings. And my Capricorns who like to act as if they don't have feelings. Also our unconscious. It questions foundations. It questions liberal order, including equity theory, which is one of my favorite theories. I do believe in equity over equality. And I see my colleague nodding his head. Yes. Legal reasoning, enlightenment, rationalism. So you can't discuss critical race theory without rationalism. And we've been a little bit unrational as of late, as we've discussed and tried to transform our society and our country into being better than what we currently are. And also neutral principles. So there's power in neutrality. If you're neutral, we've kind of changed that to say, if you're not for us, you're against us. So being neutral is being complacent with the current system and the current way things are. And critical racism challenges and discusses those neutral principles, and also constitutional law. And all of this makes sense today because on January 6th, we saw neutrality, constitutional law being broken, and irrational behavior on our nation's capital, which is a stone's throw from where Johns Hopkins is housed, right? So it's very crucial that we have this mindset as we begin to move forward with what we as humans can do to be better than what we were on January 6th. Okay. So I moved from there to bring y'all up to the 1900s and 90s. 1995. I am the generation that brought you hip hop. I'm the generation that brought you breakdancing. I'm the generation that brought you trap music. And it all culminates in 1995 when I was a senior in high school, just knew that I was popping, knew that I was ready for the world, and was prepared to start my own journey in higher education. So I get accepted, pull up to the University of South Carolina with all of my Black friends, and we're all excited because we're about to do our tour. We pull up to the Horseshoe, and a young ambassador greets us. And she's excited. I'll never forget. Her name is Mindy, for real, for real. And she was from Beaufort, because I remember that distinctly too. And she was just so excited to give us this tour. So we do our tour and we're rounding towards the end of the tour. And this is when Mindy gets super excited. Okay. She starts pointing out our Confederate museums. And she's pointing, this is a real cannonball that was fought by our men in the Civil War. This is a real cannon that was used in the Civil War. Now, at a certain point, all of us turn around, we start looking at each other like, Mindy, she colorblind? Like, what's good, sis? Like, you're proud of this part of history that oppressed us. And this is one of our founding presidents who is buried on campus, who was a huge supporter of the Civil War. Oh, okay, so he celebrated slavery. Right. And we go around to one of the part of the tour included Sims Hall, which is one of the dorms that was on campus. It also included the Thomas Cooper Library and also Wade Hampton Residential Village, and also the Strom Thurmond Wellness Center. So these aforementioned men who have names throughout the campus, University of South Carolina, they were slave owners, and in Strom Thurmond's case was anti-integration and basically anti-Black and anti-people of color. We're not going to talk, we don't have the space or time to talk about his Black daughter, but that's something else altogether. We'll get there if y'all invite me back. But this sets the tone for my introduction to higher education. University of South Carolina at that time was the cheapest institution, state institution, that a student could go to. One among the privates, even private HBCUs, their tuition costs a whole lot more than that tuition at the University of South Carolina. But it is here where really and truly my activism from being the great niece of A.J. Wittenberg and from having participated in my own marches and protests under the guidance of former Senator Ralph Anderson, may he rest in power, and having been brought up in this dynamic Blackness of celebrating Blackness and also being very aware of racism and racist ideologies. My father would always even teach me, when you go into a restaurant and get seated, always look around and see who's served first. If you're seated first and you're served last, get up and leave. So that is part of this framework of being able to notice my environment. And as I'm standing there in that horseshoe and I'm listening to the celebration of Confederacy and oppression, I understand the huge disconnect as an 18-year-old. I understand what my challenges will be as a transactional, multiple identitied Black woman in South Carolina at this university. Just remembering that and what that felt like, it just makes you have to take a minute and pause. And so I knew once I got my housing assignment, my housing assignment was Sims Hall in the Horseshoe. Sims Hall had also served as a hospital for Confederate soldiers. Most important was who Sims Hall is named after. Sims Hall is named after Dr. Sims. Dr. Sims would be the person celebrated for gynecology throughout the United States and the world. And his celebration for his research and the things that he brought and tactics that people still use was because of a 17-year-old slave woman named Anarcha Westcott. Anarcha is spelled Anarcha. Westcott, Westcott, because I know that the spell at the bottom can be a little wrong. So what I want to do is take a minute to celebrate the life of Anarcha by bringing truth to her story and what that meant to me when I was placed in this assignment as a Black woman in Sims Hall, and how sick that was. Just how disconnected the university was, just how disconnected other Black women who were happy to be in Sims Hall. So to give you a little bit of information about Anarcha, she came in contact with Dr. Sims when she was 17 and pregnant. As a slave woman, she was severely malnourished. She had a vitamin D deficiency, which disfigured her pelvis. She had been in labor for 3 days, 72 hours, before Dr. Sims was called. He came, showed up, and delivered a stillbirth baby. From that, Anarcha, it is said that she suffered from uncontrollable bowel movements that flowed through her open wounds. Let that sink in. You're 17. You give birth to a stillborn after having been in labor for 3 days. And now you are passing feces through unhealed open wounds. Dr. Sims would go on to operate on Mrs. Westcott 30 times without her permission and without any anesthesia, which was available at that time. "30 times. And at the last surgery, when he developed the actual technique, that is what would then put him in a position to be celebrated in the medical field. Crunched into little pieces if I don't define myself for myself. So let that sit and let that sink as we begin to move forward and talk about what then 1995 meant. And let that sit and let that sink in as we talk about this alleged anti in higher education. Research your own campus and ask how many buildings are named after Confederate soldiers, after slave owners, after politicians who held positions that voted against civil rights and social justice and humanity. Think about your respective campuses where you are and what that means to this claim of anti-racism in higher education. Think about 30 surgeries with no anesthesia at 17. Think about the slaves that died building the buildings that would be named after their oppressor at universities and schools that their then children would not be able to attend. And then there would be hundreds of years before their ancestors would even be allowed to attend. Okay. And I also want students to think about understanding and knowing, if you don't identify as Black, which of your identities that connects you most to your university, which of those identities were the first to graduate from your institution, were the first to attend your institution, and think about it from that perspective and that lens. So let's continue to move a little bit forward. So in 1995, and when I'm now placed in this Sims Hall, me being me, a Wittenberg with a capital W, I said, oh, hell no, I ain't staying in here. Absolutely not. And my parents knew. They said, we knew when we dropped your little ass off that by the time we got back home, you would already be living somewhere else. And they were right. That is when one of my daughter's godmother's best friend for life, who has to take secrets with her to the grave, Haley Dunbar, and I charted our own path in getting this apartment that I would later set on fire. That's a whole nother story. If I'm brought back, we'll talk about that later. But that would become my introduction to a lifelong friend who understood me, my Blackness, my womanhood, my intersectionalities, and all of my identities. And for me, now she had housing, but for me would make that sacrifice so that I could be comfortable in being educated, as comfortable as I could be. So on June 19th, 2020, the Board of Trustees agree and vote unanimously to change the name of Sims Hall. So as of June 19th, 2020, Sims Hall is no longer named Sims Hall. However, in 3 months, it'll be 1 year, and it hasn't been renamed. Okay. In January of 2021, Black student leaders renamed the Thomas Cooper Library to the Dean Willie L. Harriford Library. There had been a push to change the name without administrative support, without board support. They said, forget y'all. We're doing this. We're hosting a press conference and we are changing this name, and this is what we are going to call it. So there's power in a collective as students to force the change from racism and beginning the steps towards the goal of anti-racism. And that's the biggest, loudest voice. If I say nothing else, if you get nothing else, as we discuss anti-racism, the success and the next steps, it's on you. As an organized collective of students, as an organized collective of beings without any support they have unofficially, but very dynamically, changed the name of our now Dean Willie L. Hereford Library. The first Black students would come to the University of South Carolina in 1964. And Henry Monteith Treadwell would be the first Black person to graduate from the University of South Carolina since 1877. She is who I think needs to have her name graced on what was formerly Sims Hall. If not, Anarsha Westcott. Along with her in this class was Robert Anderson and James Solomon. So I want you all to think about your current universities, and I also want you to think about your former universities, and I want you to ask yourself if you know who that first fill in your identity person was that desegregated for your identity, your respective identity. And if you don't know that, go and learn it and try to figure it out. Research the archives and charge your library and your librarians with creating this historic roadmap that is led by culture, that is led and fueled and fed by a drive to create positive change. See, these students in January of 2021 understood the historic context. They understood where they had been and where the university had been in an effort to create the change needed to move forward in creating an anti-racist campus, in creating and supporting an anti-racist theoretical university education. Right? So you have to know where you've been in order to know where you're going. And so next, what would be next for me would be, okay, graduate from the University of South Carolina. Woo-hoo. Me and my friends and family would we're all celebrating because I barely made it out. I still don't even know how I graduated, but I did. I'm here, especially with the GPA I graduated with, right? I was like, what? I got that? So yes. And so next up for me would be graduate school. Going to graduate school in New York was something completely different because the racism there was different than what I was used to, particularly in the colleges. And the support was also very different. And it was also very refreshing. And it prepared me for professionalism and the ability to address racism and racist policies in higher education and the impact that they have on systematically non-dominant students, faculty, and staff at those institutions. Now, I choose to use the language systematically non-dominant. I don't like I don't like minority because there's kind of like a negative connotation there. I use systematically non-dominant because it is actually the system that makes people dominant or non-dominant. There are systems in place that go all the way back to A.J. Wittenberg and the segregation and desegregation of colleges and universities that make people a dominant, giving access, having access, and going back to Kimberly Crenshaw of those particular identities, giving more power, and non-dominant, marrying the critical race theory of the systems that were inherently and purposely put in place to keep people of color from being able to close the gap, okay? So when we talk about our systems and our systematically non-dominant folks, We need to, and from a framework of higher education, while respecting our historic perspectives, we need to bring to light and to focus that we are still working on these campuses and working with students who don't have full access, where they are in residential villages named after slave owners, going to libraries to educate themselves, named after politicians who voted against their very being right and opportunity to even hold space. So on my education train that's personal, I'm now at St. John's University. Hey, y'all. And I'm like working, and I told y'all I was a historian. So I was like, well, let me get my doctorate in history. And applied. And when I applied, I had to give what my research was going to be. My research on my application was Black Women's Revolution, Black Women's Civil Rights Movement from 1865 to 1920. Because the suffrage movement is not ours. That is non-inclusive of Black women. And so we don't even know. And that's a whole nother discussion. And my application was denied. I know it wasn't that GPA from USC. I don't know how I got out of there, but I know that wasn't it. I had graduated summa magna cum laude, my master's degree. What was the problem? Well, then the chair, the dean sent me a message and said, that is not the research that would be accepted at this history department. Okay. Unbeknownst to me, 2 Black colleagues stepped in, and I won't mention their names because I didn't get their permission, and they didn't even know that, I was going to be talking about them. But they stepped in and they questioned this dean, because she's the chair, sister the chair, thank you. And the dean couldn't answer. So they said, okay, she's in this program. What did the dean do? She made sure I took her class first. And she made it publicly known in the class that my research topic of celebrating the accomplishments of Black women leaders was not one that was going to be accepted. Her theory and her own research was on Nazi porcelain. And in my head, I'm thinking, you talking about some damn racist plates, but you're mad because I want to bring to light and bring to focus Black women who were creating and who were catalysts of positive change for not just our community, but for society as a whole. You don't want me in this program. There was another professor whose research and work was centered on Africa, but had heard through the grapevine that I was having these challenges and agreed to work with me. I would go to the Schomburg, I would take the LIE all the way into the city, transfer trains, get to Harlem, and I would literally spend the entire day after day after day at the Schomburg until it closed, reading, microfilm and putting together this amazing this amazing presentation. And I would then work with this professor to make it perfect. She gave me an F. First F I'd ever earned. I got Fs before, but that was because I overslept. The class was at 7:30 in the morning. I should have known better. I didn't earn those. I slept through them. But I earned this F. And I was so proud of this grade because I knew it was more of a reflection on her than it ever was about me and my ability. Now, this is in Queens, New York. This is in the early 2000s. But this, as a doctoral student, was the racism that I was facing in achieving and trying to move forward my own education. My St. John's people texted me now like, oh, I'm so mad, but yeah. And I named that here because, again, the topic is anti-racism in higher education. So I don't want you to think that racism stops at racist monuments and dorms and libraries named after racist people. It's deeper than that. It goes into a system that allows a dean to fail a student because she doesn't like the topic, not because of the work, not because of the research, but because of this still wall of racism. I still have my paper. I'm still very proud of my work. I still call myself a historian. But I am also still all but dissertation. I am also still not a doctor of my field. And those ancestors that I was celebrating in my research have not been celebrated to the fullest extent of what they should. And I said that to say, from my own personal story, we go from those monuments at the University of South Carolina and transition to this dean in the Northeast, where we as Southern Blacks look to as a symbol of freedom, right? And when talking about Black women and Black people, there's an underlying depth to that. So then I move and transition, I leave New York, and I'm in Savannah, Georgia. And Savannah is what is the Deep South. And I am at a university that was named after someone who donated the land for the university to exist to segregate and keep Black people out and to allow white community members to send their children to a local school because they didn't want to send them to Savannah State, which is the historically Black university. Savannah State never said white folks can't come here. White folks said, we ain't going there. And so now here I am working at Armstrong, then Atlantic State University. And at this institution, I am given the freedom. Let's go back to critical race theory. So now in this environment, I have the power to be an anti-racist champion and start a path to create positive anti-racist change. The president of the university, Dr. Linda Blyken, I know I didn't get her permission, but she's amazing, would give me free rein to write grants for programs that were specifically towards Black men achieving, Black men traveling, Black men exposure, Black men retaining, and Black men graduating. From there, additional funding to do the same for Black women. From there, additional staff and additional funding to do the same thing for our Latinx brothers and sisters. And from there, additional funding and additional personnel to support our gender sex minority students. This opportunity to go to work every day and do anti-racist work, the best time of my life. Best work environment, best work experience, and just the ease in which I was able to do that without facing the wrath of politicians from doing the work. That part of my life from 2012 to 2017 was the best part of being an anti-racist social justice advocate. Even when I was in New York, I saw my students struggle. You know, Gary Santos Mendoza is on the call, and he was one of the first students that addressed an inner racism among Latinx students by combining two polar Latinx organizations together to say we are no longer going to be Afro-Latinos in this organization, non-Afro-Latinos in this organization, but we're going to be one. And the work in the Northeast in New York that he faced and the challenges that they faced as students to be able to be anti-racist was also painful and hurtful to watch and see. The support of colleagues to be dynamic enough to push a closed system to create positive change. And now we're at, a Catholic university creating a prayer room and a prayer space at St. John's because students were praying in closets. And even still, there were challenges, but it got done. There were challenges in how we would celebrate Latinx Heritage Month, but it got done. And the difference, and the reason why I'm bringing that up, is that because at Armstrong, those challenges were mitigated. Those challenges were not supported by higher administration. Those challenges would be removed by me having one simple conversation with the president of the university. And then the efforts were supported by the community. The Savannah chapter of the Links from start to finish would support efforts that supported students of color at Armstrong State University. The Black alums from Armstrong State University also heavily supported. And we got support also from Savannah State and also from the city of Savannah and our community, because we were seen as local change agents. And the city of Savannah was ready to address systemic challenges and racism in higher education and within the community. There are still challenges that exist, but the comfort is knowing that there are people doing the work to make that change. So then let's bring it here to North Carolina State. The challenge here in practicing critical race theory has been one of the hardest that I've ever faced. We're in the Capitol, and it's the largest state school in the state of North Carolina. And so we have very active politicians involved in what it is that we can do and say and how we can address diversity in education. And without going into the politics of everything, what I will say is I gave an interview when I first got to the university, because the newspapers want to celebrate your coming. And in that interview, they asked me, what had you recently done that you would like to see and could see at this university? That same day, a colleague, Nick Schrader from Armstrong, who is the director of housing, had called me to let me know that 100% of the students from the the women of color living learning community had not only come back and made a commitment to come back and live in the community, but they had also paid their money. And so I had a 100% success rate with Black and Latinas living and educating together. And so I mentioned this to the newspaper because it was fresh, it was brand new, it's the same day. And I mean, who's not happy? You know, I'm pretty sure Joseph would love to be able to say 100%, like, damn, that's good. And so I was feeling myself, and it hit the newspapers. What would happen next would be conservative newspaper media taking things that I said in one article that I agreed to give and changing the context before and after, and printing it. And it was legal because, yes, I said it, but they could change the context, the meaning of what that was. And then the title would call me a segregationist. What? Like, I could feel my ancestors, you know, rolling over in their grave. I was like, y'all gonna make AJ rise up. Okay. And, you know, in the onslaught of harassment that came from alums and members of the community, and the names I would be called, like having to change my social media, privacy settings, and at the time having a little bitty one who was not even one yet, and finding, I think there were like 5 snakes inside of my on-campus apartment. And of those 5 snakes, they had to call in a snake expert, and y'all, I'm talking real shit. Lucy is on the call, she can tell you, because I would call her crying profusely. And like 2 were copperheads, a green snake and a black snake with my baby. So we would move on campus to 2 other apartments before I finally said, you know what, enough is enough. I'm gonna move to a neighborhood far enough away so that I can continue to do the work. But this is within less than 3 months of my getting there, where there were already challenges of me beginning to start the work of anti-racism at this university. So it let me know it was a message, okay, this is where you need to be. It's gonna be hard, but you know who you are, you know your why, and you know that you define yourself for yourself. You don't run easy, sis. And so 3 years later, I'm still here doing the work, and I will continue to do the work because the work, it's not for me, it's for these students. One of the biggest changes we were able to see was the Board of Trustees voting to change the name of Daniels Hall. It is still unnamed, you know, but that was one piece in place of progress. The other pieces that we were able to see was a large amount of student people, of student peaceful protests being supported. When the repeal of DACA happened in 2017, we were able to support our students by bringing in university lawyers and university counsel. When there have been an enormous amount of raids that hit certain populations, and we were able to support our students with emergency housing, internships, jobs, and ways to support them and provide access to support for their families as well. And we were able to find additional scholarship and scholarship funds for our students whose parents had been deported. All of this during the 45 era, right? And I won't speak his name. And so that's where the headway kind of began. And that is where we were able to make intentional positive change at, you know, North Carolina State. And as we came through COVID and entered into Black Lives Matter, there became an enormous amount of support from administration to be very visible and vocal in support of students of color, and to create institutional changes and support institutional changes that were led by students in order to address these critical race conversations and challenges that we were facing. So I leave you to say that the work still needs to be done and still needs to be continued. And, for those of you who are students, faculty, and staff, wherever you are, continue to support the Joseph Colons. Continue to support the offices of multicultural affairs and the multicultural student affairs offices, because we are doing the work. We are boots on the ground. We are doing the work to establish our institutions and the policies for our institutions, and we're leading the way to be catalysts of positive change towards anti-racism and anti-racist campuses, and addressing those different systemic oppressive systems and dismantling those while we are being that catalyst for our students. And we do it not because we get paid a hell of a lot of money, because Joseph can tell you we don't. We do it not because it was something that we were told to do, but we do it because we were called to do it. And one of the ways you can do that is financially supporting, your own. Each university has this huge day of giving, and it's okay to go in and say, I'm going to financially support the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I'm going to go in, do my research, and support those scholarships that specifically support systematically non-dominant students. I'm going to look around the room and see if I am a white face among many white faces. I'm going to be the one to ask the question, well, where's so-and-so? Where's this face? Where's that face? Do we have anybody from Disability Resource Services here to represent our different students? Do we have anyone who self-identifies as trans as a part of their intersectional identity here at the table as we talk about change? Do we have any women of color here at the table to discuss and talk about change? And if not, be the one that is the catalyst to name the thing. I know who I am. And if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Thank you. I am Nasha Carmen Wittenberg, and this concludes my speech for today. And I am excited to look in this chat and let's do some discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wittenberg. I'm not sure if people are putting their questions in the chat right now. There is a question and answer section, so feel free to use that to send in any of your questions. And we also have the chat, so either way works, and we'll be able to see them amongst the panelists and give in the questions. But I did have a question to start off with. So recently I saw online where they were talking about the modern day conception of integration. And a lot of times they're talking about, especially in diversity and inclusion, integration tends to still we still tend to think about it as like bringing Black and brown bodies into white supremacist spaces. And I thought that was an interesting, idea. And I wanted to get your take on it. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's necessarily a bad thing? So yeah.
So my Aunt Doris wrote a column in a paper against integration in the 1960s. She saw this as the end of Black schools, the end of Black neighborhoods, and our Black Wall Streets. And I understand her perspective. So on my mother's side, we had radicals who were anti-segregation, and on my dad's side, We had radicals who were for segregation, and this is what you get right here. I think when we talk about integration and we talk about racism, one thing is for sure, the South thinks that they own racism, right? We own it, it's ours. No, that's not the case. And the other thing is we think of racism in terms of white and black, black and brown, BIPOC, people of color. When we need to talk about racism in an all-inclusive format, and for me, in talking about integration and inclusion, I have to discuss it from the lens of a trans person of color. Because once you begin to create and make these safe spaces and begin to truly integrate people, you're celebrating all of a person's identities. And we, as a culture of Black folk and as a culture in general, have and continue to ignore systemically the needs of our trans men and women. So when I think about integration, I'm thinking about how can I make sure the voices of my gender sex minority, and in particular, my student who identify as transgender, how can I make sure their voices are at the table? Because I know that when I do that, then that automatically includes the voices of everyone else. When you can focus in on the group of folks that are being hurt the most and the loudest, very visibly, but without any champions, without any advocacy, when you create that space for advocacy for that particular group, everyone else wins. But we don't see it like that, particularly when we're talking about integration. We want to keep integration in terms of white and Black. I need people to understand that racism, integration, segregation, and desegregation, all of those things have been the cornerstone of what we call America, but it has transitioned. So because we're not talking about it in Black and white, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It still does exist in Black and white, but it has transformed itself into something else. Racists also like to say, well, I'm not a member of the Klan, so I'm not racist. But you support racist policies, you vote for racist policies, you vote for a lack of any person to be integrated into a broader scheme of success when you're talking about moving forward. So we need to think about integration as being transformative. What does that mean and for who? And we need to think about the work that we need to do in order to fully integrate just not this larger set of people, but those we are constantly leaving out of the conversation. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I'm assuming some people would want to ask about this. You did mention about like renaming, and recently we found out, I'm not sure if you're familiar in the news, but they said that Johns Hopkins, the namesake was owned slaves. So essentially, there was a lot of discussion on this. We had like naming committees. I was in one of the meetings for that, and there was a lot of things. And from my point of view, I was kind of like, there's no way Hopkins is just gonna rename the whole school. But at the same time, I think one of the stories you mentioned was a more forceful renaming. And I can't imagine somebody like walking up to like Gildersleeves on campus and just putting a new name on there and stuff like that and kind of being like, okay, this is gonna be the way it is. But I guess my question is, what is a more modern way of approaching this? Or do you think that's something we should like truly spend a lot of time in considering on this campus particularly?
I think you should spend time in the conversation, whether it leads to a name changing or not. And I mentioned the University of South Carolina with what happened in January of 2021, where students said, to hell with your rules, this is what we are naming this, and this is what we will be calling it henceforth, regardless of what you have decided to put and keep on the building. That is something that is in the hands of the student to do. That is something that is the responsibility of the student, whether it's formalized or not. Begin to make peaceful noise. And what I mean by that goes back to John Lewis, make good trouble, right? Peaceful noise is where you don't stop talking about the conversation because someone has told you to stop. You don't stop talking about the conversation because someone has told you you can't. And you don't carry an I can't mentality or this won't happen mentality. Peaceful noise is noise that is steeped in theory. Peaceful noise is noise that includes those characters who have created that type of positive change on their campuses. Peaceful noise is noise that is non-stop and speaks to peace, but it doesn't mean that it's nice. So if you look at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we're talking about what's not nice. And when old Sam got pulled down by students to say, we want this racist off of our campus, those are conversations that are to be had, and those protests that happen on campus in support of Black Lives Matter, where students are wanting the administration to be more vocal and visible, that's all part of peaceful noise, right? And so as students, you have much more power than non-tenured faculty in particular, and staff. We are, and most of us are in positions where, we can be fired tomorrow for no reason. We can be fired tomorrow if we decide to marry someone of the same gender. We can be fired tomorrow if we decide that we want to change our religion, or we're going to fully be expressive as a trans person of color. So it's up to the students and those who have the power of tenure to continue to create that peaceful noise while also keeping everyone else in mind. I remember, I identified that Armstrong State University was named for the person who donated the land, who was a segregationist. There's power in continuing to have that name, but the power is the fact that we talk about it. So yes, Johns Hopkins name doesn't have to change, but talking about what was and the why, that is the piece that needs to happen. So it can be as simple as when you go to a university's webpage, it has the about column and who we are, and you can click on all of these fabulous things about the university. It can also have a column of where we started, and click on that and let the truth be told of where we started and why. And then it can go into websites and links like OMA to address and talk about how we're addressing that historic piece that was not pretty. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't have to conclude with Johns Hopkins now being, John Lewis University, which would be great, actually. Think about it, but it has to include the conversation. When we don't talk about our roots, no matter how bad or ugly they are, we play into that systemic racism. We buy into it. We play into the system, and we allow our hands to continue to be tied.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. And I didn't hear that idea even close to be mentioned in any of the meetings I was in. So that's definitely something I can bring up to faculty and also my friends who are in it.
It's simple. It can be done. It's easy to be done. And then from there, work with the university library creating this history timeline. And so a history timeline could also address the hurt, the pain, the dirty, the ugly, but bring you to where you are, into a and place of celebration. And then it becomes a responsibility for the next class and the next group and the next generation to continue to push that anti-racism timeline forward. It begins to state the things, name the things, place the things, and make everyone responsible and accountable for not going backward, but continuing to go forward.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I saw there was a question in the chat that said, for someone interested in getting started in the, I think that's diversity, equity, and inclusion field, what steps should be taken?
One, I will say, I see it now, for someone interested in getting started in DEI, what steps should be taken? I always say the first step is knowing who you are, right? So you got to know what step you're going to take by knowing your framework. I am never ashamed to say my framework is always from a perspective of a Black woman and celebrating all of my identities, going back to Kimberly Crenshaw. So when you know that, then the next step, if you don't have a therapist, get one. I saw mine today from 11 to 12, right before this speech, because I needed to gather all the things and get all of them gathered. I say that because it's not easy work. It's not easy work. And if you don't have mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, and support in the work for yourself, you will feel as though you are being crunched into someone else's fantasies of you. So that therapy is crucial. The next step, I would say, would be delve deeper into critical race theory. Shakina, I'm not sure if you are connected to the Office of Multicultural Affairs. If you aren't, get connected, attend events, intern like Mr. Campbell. Get connected. I'm not sure if you're a student or if you're a member of faculty or staff. If you're a student, get connected to student organizations that do the work of DEI, which is anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yes, also read. Thank you for putting that in there. Read. And then here's a conference that I want you to attend. It's NCORE. So NCORE is the conference for the work that we do, right? And I can't even remember what the acronym means, but if you Google it, Google will tell you the things. But attending those conferences, making your network, knowing who you are, and doing the work you want to do for the population you want to do it for, that's how you get started. Even if it's on a voluntary basis, to volunteer in the office. That's how you get started. Thank you, Javon. You know what? They got you as an intern, but I'm hiring 3 positions. You're dropping links, shameless plug. Go to the NC State webpage and give us a little eye candy and think about applying the way you're dropping these links up in here. But yes. Yes, thank you. Go to that link. There are all types of DEI, even current. There's so much information through NCORE that you can learn. I think that is the best way to start. And then next, get you a mentor. One of my mentors, I think, is on the call. She don't know that she's a mentor, but she is, Melissa Green. I have a mentor on every campus where I work, right? But she is the one that currently keeps my soul steady. And then there's also Lucero Rodriguez, doctor, who's another mentor, best friend of mine. So mentors, mental health, those are all things that you need to get started. And NCORE is a really good starting place for on a professional level.
Thank you, Ms. Nasha Wittenberg. Thank you for being here with us today. if we were all in person, I would say a round of claps. So I'm just going to do it anyways, because this was an amazing conversation, an amazing talk, and, really grasped all of our attention, including our family members that are living here. I had my spouse here, sitting in and listening. So I wanted to say that thank you so much for being here with us today, and spending this afternoon with this amazing conversation. And I do want to thank all of our participants for being here today. We had an amazing audience. Thank you all for joining us. And if you're interested in joining at our future events, we have another upcoming Digital Diversity Day series featuring Professor Gerald Torres on April 8th. And that will be at 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. And I know that our amazing intern, Javon, will also drop more links for our upcoming events. So thank you so much, Javon, for doing that as well. And again, thank you all for being with us today. This amazing conversation doesn't end here, and we continue with this celebration, and we continue with engaging in this conversation, because it doesn't stop. We continue. And if those of you that are interested in participating with us at OMA, feel free to email me or reach out to Kwame Phillips or Joseph Colon. We are all here to help you engage in person work, on-campus work, virtually now until we get back on campus, of course, but we're definitely here as a support system. And this conversation continues. And thank you so much, Ms. Nasha Wittenberg, for joining us today and being with us today and having this conversation. If you all have any questions, I will stay back until we close out for the next few minutes. Feel free to put in any questions on the chat or stay back to have a conversation with me. Thank you again.
Thank y'all for the comments. This is like a family reunion. I cannot wait to get vaccinated so that I can come and hug all of you guys. It's gonna be amazing.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to do a quick note that our next event will be with Miss Emily Hickey, one of our very own OMA staff members. So that will be the OMA Takeover on March 8th. Thank you all for coming out.
Reaction. So, like trying to make sure that I'm reading my audience. That part.
Yeah, I can imagine. And we're also off camera just so that for recording purposes and whatnot to give you
right.
You can't even see our reactions, even though we're not
Like I was good because Joseph, the director, he had his camera on, and so then I was reacting off his, and then he turned the camera off, and I was like,
well, I was definitely nodding heads and saying, and definitely
the lens. Yeah, I definitely want to come. I can't wait for my face to be one of those little circles over there.
Okay, Kwame is just running through. All right, so I think this concludes our conversation today. See any other